Thank you for inviting me, and you're not contributing maybe to my healthy aging, but to my joyful living by having invited me here and giving me the opportunity to be in Venice, which is very nice. Okay, just one, we had a misunderstanding apparently. I'm not the chairman of the German Standing Committee on Vaccination. I'm not even a member, but I'm working in the Robert Koch Institute, which is the National Public Health Institute, in the scientific secretariat of the STIKO, the Standing Committee on Vaccination. So we prepare their recommendations by compiling the scientific evidence and partially also by doing studies and creating evidence in that way. Okay. So my conflicts of interest, first of all, so I'm an epidemiologist, as I said, in this executive secretariat, so I don't know if you consider that a conflict, and I never received any honoraria or funding for studies or anything from companies, from vaccine companies. Let me start with I have bad news for you and good news. So the bad news is that there will be quite a bit of overlap with Johann's presentation, because given the title of his presentation, I didn't expect that you would talk so much about vaccines, but that's fine. The good news is that I do have some additional aspects to add. So I hope it will not be too boring. And let me start with a question. So if you were to vaccinate a person aged 65 years old, which vaccine would you choose? Just give me a quick show of hands. Who would use the Prevnar 13? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not so many. Who would use the Pneumovax? Even, well, about the same number. Who would use the sequential vaccination? That's the majority. Who would say that is not, we don't need routine vaccination for 65-year-olds and elderly? No one? Okay, not in this meeting, huh? Okay, so let me show you what I found from the ECDC vaccine schedule site, what the recommendations are in different countries. There's like 20 footnotes, so for every country there's almost a footnote, which I spare you here, and I did the coloring, and I learned already that some things are not correct, like in Belgium. What I extracted from the ECDC website is that vaccination is only starting at the age of 85 or 86 with PCV13, and Johann told me it's not correct. Yeah. And what about Italy? Sequential vaccination, is that correct? Someone of you must know. It's correct. And then, for example, we have Spain. There's a Spanish person here. So you're using PPSV 23, is that correct? Yes. And so does Germany. So, and the recommendation that you see for Germany here is to say, yes, Pneumovax 23, and it should be repeated every 6 years. And this is the result of an evaluation process that took us about 2 years. Of course, before the PCV13 licensure was expanded to adults, the world was easy. There was only one vaccine. So it all started with this expansion that countries had to re-evaluate their recommendations and see if a change was needed. And we started that in 2014. And then we were, of course, eagerly waiting for the results of the CAPITA study, which were published in March 2015. And then based on that, we sort of discussed things. And it was a long and controversial discussion in Germany. Okay. So we wrote that all up also in an English version, which you can freely download from the website of the Robert Koch Institute. And it's 35 pages, so I warn you, and I will only give you a few highlights from this report. And I want to work along those questions here. You can read them yourselves. Okay, so which vaccines are available? We saw that already in a graphically much nicer slide from Johann. Here again, the conjugate vaccines, which are sort of a matrushka, so every higher valent one is containing all the serotypes from the previous ones, and in Pneumovax 23 you have all of the 13 except 6A plus 11 other ones. And I also put the serotype 3 in red here because I totally agree with Johan that it is special. And I'm going to show you why. And here again, this is data from a laboratory-based voluntary surveillance system of IPD that we have in Germany. So we do not have IPD as a mandatory notifiable disease. That's also why we can't report rates. And all these are serotypes, so they are from here. It's IPD cases above 60 years, but it essentially looks the same for, or very similar for children and younger adults as well. So what are the colors? The two, well, what is it? Yellowish and orange are serotypes included in PCV13, and the serotype 3 is, I've separated it out here because it behaves differently. And then the red ones are those that are additionally covered by PPSV23. And the gray ones are those that are not covered by any of these vaccines. So we started the system in 2007, and then you can see that almost the difference between the coverage of PCV13 and PPSV23 was very small, and there were very few non-vaccine serotypes. And that was when PCV7 was introduced for the infant vaccination. And then in 2010, basically, we switched to PCV13, and then you see that the proportion of the PCV13 serotypes also in the adults goes down quite a bit. And now here in the last full season, 2015-16, about 30% of the IPD cases in the elderly were caused by the PCV13 serotypes that has more than halved, and PPV23 serotypes now cover about 70%. Don't get irritated by the absolute increase here. That's a surveillance artifact because we managed to recruit more laboratories to report. It's only the proportions that you can really interpret, but we do see replacement disease with non-vaccine serotypes, so we do need better vaccines. That's a clear message. And as I said, serotype 3 is special. If you look here, it's more than half of the still existing PCV13 serotypes are serotype 3. And what happened over the years? If you look here at the green line, that's the PCV7 serotype. So as the PCV7 was introduced for infant vaccination, that one went down in the adults to very low levels. The extra 5 serotypes in PCV13, except serotype 3, they initially went up, so they behaved like replacing serotypes. They could occupy the ecological niche that was vacated by the PCV7 serotypes, and then, like with a delay of 1 season after the switch in the infants, these 5 serotypes took the same course as the PCV7 serotypes before. But serotype 3 clearly behaves differently. It was pretty unimpressed by things changing here in the vaccination schedule for the children until 2013-14, and then it even went up quite a bit. So there's also a biological explanation for that. I'm not a microbiologist, but what the microbiologists tell me is that serotype 3, as opposed to all the other serotypes, has a different metabolic pathway of producing its polysaccharide capsule. And it's a very smart serotype because when it gets opsonized by antibodies, which would be the first step for phagocytosis, it can just eject the polysaccharide together with the antibody, and then it's no longer opsonized, so it can survive. So the question is really, as Johan said already, is it vaccine preventable? I think there's a big question mark behind that. Now, this was data from IPD cases. So one argument that is often heard is that the serotype distribution in non-bacteremic pneumonia is maybe different. Okay, now, is it useful to make this sharp distinction between bacteremic and non-bacteremic pneumonia, or IPD and pneumonia without bacteremia? I don't think so, because if you have a patient with a pneumococcal pneumonia and you don't take a blood culture, it's always non-bacteremic, right? And if you take a blood culture and you don't find it, maybe if you took another blood culture 12 hours later, you would find it. So I find this quite difficult to say. Also, if you think about the pathophysiology, it's aspiration pneumonia. But if you, as we heard this morning, if you only aspirate and you have a functioning cilia clearance and you're good coughing and so on, you don't get pneumonia. So I think in order to get pneumonia, there has to be invasion, at least in the lung. So maybe you don't find it in blood, but still there is some invasion. And if you have serum antibodies, this invasion could still be stopped. And also the non-pneumonia IPD in elderly people is actually quite rare. So this area here should be quite small. The most part of IPD in elderly people is pneumonia. So these two are really closely linked. So what data do we have? Of course, it's quite difficult to determine serotypes if you don't have an isolate. It cannot be done by culture. Sputum is a problematic substrate. So what is being done now is to use this urine antigen detection assay, which can detect the 13 serotypes that are included in PCV13. And there is a study done in Germany of adult patients with pneumococcal pneumonia, and they published it last year, but the data are only up to 2011. And in this period here, they had 60% of the non-bacteremic pneumococcal pneumonia that was caused by PCV13. And if you go back here in our IPD cases to this time, 2007, 2011, that's also 60%. So it seems very similar. And there's also another study from Nottingham who have their own kind of UAD test where they can also determine serotypes by urine test. And this is a lot to read, but they started in 2008, so that was before the switch to PCV13, which in the UK happened in 2010. So they had 2 years before and like 2 years after. And the conclusion is that they say the incidence of adult pneumococcal pneumonia declined, with serotypes included in PCV13 declining post-PCV13 introduction, indicating early herd protection effects from PCV13 infant vaccination on adult non-bacteremic disease. So it seems that non-bacteremic disease follows the same pattern in serotype distribution as invasive pneumococcal disease. Oh, in that sense, of course, then it's better to have 23 serotypes covered. It would be better to have all 90, but 23 certainly better than 13, provided the vaccine is effective, of course. That's the next important question. And so we did this systematic literature review that Johan showed us already, so I was quite pleased of that. And we defined clear PCOS criteria to say we are only interested in studies in the target group for this recommendation, which should be vaccination with PPSV23 and not with any of the previous versions of polysaccharide vaccines, which included 50 micrograms of antigen per serotype instead of 25 in the PPSV23, so that could have quite a different efficacy. And the comparator should be no vaccination or placebo. And the endpoints we looked at are the specific endpoints, pneumococcal disease. And we included both RCTs and observational epidemiological studies, provided they were able to adjust for confounders. Of course, if you have an at-risk condition, you're not only more likely to get ill with pneumococci, but you're also maybe more likely to be vaccinated because it is recommended for you. So now I compare this with the Cochrane review by Moberly from 2013, which included many, many studies, but we selected only those following that fulfilled our PCOS criteria. And you see mostly the reason for exclusion was that the many studies are quite old studies that were done with previous versions of the polysaccharide vaccines. And I will come back to these two studies that are highlighted in the light yellow here. So you saw this plot already for IPD. There's not much discussion. Everyone agrees that the vaccine is effective, although unfortunately the confidence interval here is very wide. But there's also data from observational studies that confirm the efficacy against, or the effectiveness against IPD. Now, looking at pneumococcal pneumonia, if we take all these 4 studies again, There's a non-significant effect. It's 25% vaccine efficacy, but including zero efficacy. So it's from minus 62% to 65%. And if you look at the plot here, you see there's these two studies that show no effect, and there's two studies that show quite a strong effect. And in mathematical ways, you can express that with the measurement of heterogeneity between the studies. And whenever you see such a thing with a high heterogeneity, you should be wary whether it's permitted to do a meta-analysis, or you should ask, what is the difference? Are they different populations? Are there different interventions? Well, they're not. But what we found out is that the two studies here, Erdquist and Honkanen, they used a very unusual way of diagnosing pneumococcal pneumonia, and that is by detecting pneumolysin antibodies in serum, which they which was done in the same laboratory for both studies with a non-validated in-house ELISA. So that carries a high risk of bias, of course. Has anybody used this test in clinical practice? And these studies are from the 90s, so the fact that it never caught on and was not introduced in routine, I think, tells us already something about the test. And then we found a couple of studies, of which I'm going to show you only two, there are more, that try to validate this test after the vaccine efficacy studies. So that is a publication here, which interestingly includes as authors those ladies who also developed the ELISA in the first place, and they, in the discussion, they said that you need a test with a very high specificity. With only a modest reduction in specificity, it is possible to observe a null result in the study of a highly efficacious vaccine, and they found that this test is not suitable for doing that. And that same result was obtained by a different group in the United States who also tested this, and they came to the conclusion that assaying for IgG antibodies to pneumolysin in circulating immune complexes is not a valid method for diagnosing pneumococcal pneumonia. These findings raise substantial questions about recent reports that claim to show the lack of efficacy of pneumococcal vaccine. And what they mean is the studies by Erdquist and Honkanen. So we decided that we should do a sensitivity analysis by just including the studies with a low risk of bias, which is the Maruyama and Alpha Geme. And then, of course, we see quite a good vaccine efficacy of 64%, which is significant, and no heterogeneity anymore. Okay. Now, that is, of course, not a very nice situation where you have basically, we have only one study that showed this efficacy, because the other study was so small that the weight is very low. So we looked whether we could find any additional evidence. So we also looked at observational studies, and they also show here 45% efficacy against IPD and against pneumococcal community-acquired pneumonia, an efficacy of 48%, which is also significant. And in addition, now as a proof of principle, there are the studies that were done to develop the vaccines in the first place in the South African gold miners. You cannot directly compare that. They were young, healthy males, but they had a very high rate of pneumococcal pneumonia, and the vaccine was very effective in preventing that pneumonia. So it supports the assumption that the vaccine does work against pneumonia. Now, taking all this together, our meta-analysis showed these values. Here in black, the results from the RCTs, in red, the results from the observational studies. And if you take from the Capita study the efficacy against vaccine types, so only the PCV13 types, it's very similar to what is shown here in the observational studies and here in the pneumonia against all serotypes. Of course, the PCV13 is not that effective just because it doesn't have this broad serotype coverage. And that was at a time when in the Netherlands the PCV13 was not even used in the infant vaccination program. So if you were to repeat the study now, you would see even lower efficacy here, although the efficacy against the PCV13 serotypes is good. And this is a bit lower than the number you normally read of 45%, because this is the modified intention to treat analysis, and we can maybe discuss that later, what the difference is. Okay, the problem is that there's a limited duration of protection, which is also probably more of a problem for the pneumovax. And so the question is, should the elderly be repeatedly vaccinated against pneumococcal disease, which is already recommended for people with specific risk conditions? So why should it not be recommended for the people who have age as a risk factor? And we also did a systematic literature review on that, which has also been published. So we didn't find any study with clinical endpoints that looked at the efficacy of revaccination. And we found in total 14 studies, 9 of which reported immunogenicity, which is problematic. It's not a good correlate of protection. And 10 reported reactogenicity and safety. So because there's this concern of hyporesponsiveness, we extracted here some data from 6 studies. So the problem is the studies are very heterogeneous in structure. They look at different serotypes. They use different types of ELISA. They use some functional tests, and so on and so on. So just for orientation. So this is what happens after the first dose. Pre-vaccination, 1 month, 2 months, and so on, up to 10 years. And this is then after the second dose. So this is hyporesponsiveness. So after the first dose, you reach higher levels of antibodies than after the second dose. But it doesn't mean that the second dose decreases your level of antibody. I think that's a misconception that some people have. When they hear hyporesponsiveness, they think they do harm by giving a second dose of pneumovax, which is not the case. If you look later at 24 months or at 5 years, then suddenly the levels after the second dose are no longer lower than after the first dose. For this serotype here, they are even a bit higher, or in this study, sorry, not for this serotype. So the overall picture is that hyporesponsiveness seems to be a phenomenon that is only observed like in the first year after the revaccination, and later on there's not much difference between antibody levels. The other concern is reactogenicity, and there's quite a good study, I think, from Lisa Jackson here, which is already quite old, from 1999. And they compared the side effects after a first vaccination and after a revaccination at least 5 years after the first dose. And you have to look at the numbers in brackets here, because they are the ones, the percentages. So the size of the groups, this first vaccination group is about twice the size than that one. And yes, after the second dose, the frequency of side effects is quite a bit higher than after the first dose. For example, any limitation of arm movement, 32%, it's okay. It's not nice, but this is a thing of the first 3 days. So if you go beyond day 2, most of that has disappeared. And I think it's a communication challenge. You have to tell the patients, yes, it will hurt more, but if you don't get vaccinated, you will probably lose protection against the disease that can kill you. So I think the balance is okay. It's not ideal, but yeah, probably acceptable. So the next step then, of course, was to model the impact of a vaccination program at the population level. And we commissioned that to a group at the Center for Health Economics Research at the Leibniz University in Hanover. So I want to mention Alexander Kuhlmann here. So the first step was to model the serotype evolution that is influenced by the childhood vaccination but also on the people over 60 years. And that is, of course, based on what has been observed in the past that was used to develop the model and then predicting the future. So the blue ones here are the PCV7 serotypes that have already almost disappeared. Then we have the extra 5 serotypes that are predicted to disappear rather soon. There's serotype 3, which according to the model and according to the data we have is more likely to persist than to disappear. We have the additional serotypes in the PPSV23, and we have the non-vaccine serotypes. And we have an absolute increase. So that absolute increase is purely due to the fact that in the future, a larger part of the population, or the population above 60 years, will grow in absolute numbers. If you take out the demographic effects, you would have a flat line here. Based on that, they modeled the impact of different vaccination strategies. So the input parameters for the base case, and of course it's crucial what you choose here, is the serotype mix prediction as shown here, initial vaccination efficacy of these values with a waning curve. So we assume that the efficacy is dropping very fast, and we assumed half efficacy of these values against serotype 3 for both vaccines. Duration of protection is shorter for PPSV23 than for the PCV13. This is taken from a childhood study. Vaccination uptake at the current rate in Germany, which was assumed to remain at 30%. And we also assumed that 20% of all CUP is caused by pneumococcus. So we didn't, that was done in 2015. So we didn't have the data that Johan showed us from Edinburgh, so maybe the true proportion is a bit higher, more around 30%, which would of course improve the impact of a vaccination program. I don't show you the results of the economic analysis, just to mention that the price of PCV13 in Germany is twice the price of PPSV23. We did multiple sensitivity analyses, also including a scenario with 0% efficacy of the pneumovax against non-invasive pneumococcal pneumonia, because that is always claimed. It did not fundamentally change the picture, because the highest impact on hospital utilization and death is still from the invasive cases. So the results, if you vaccinate at the age 60 with PCV13, you can avert 725 hospitalizations over the remaining lifetime of those people. So that is about 25 years, right? So that's only 26 hospitalizations per year. That's a negligible impact. 4 deaths per year, and you have here numbers needed to vaccinate, which are quite high. If you do your one-time vaccination with pneumovax, you have about 3 times higher numbers of averted hospitalizations and deaths, and accordingly, you have to vaccinate fewer people to prevent one case. And then we looked at what is the effect of the sequential vaccination, and you see that the additional benefit from adding PCV13 is very small. And if you look at the number of PCV13 doses you have to give in addition to PPV23, which you're giving anyway, so they are huge. So the one-time vaccination strategy is not a good thing. If you do that at 65 years or 70 years, of course it looks a bit better, but on the other hand, you also have people falling ill with pneumococcal disease before they reach that age. So you would have to know when a person is going to die and then vaccinate him 5 years before. And then you prevent the death, and then you're wrong again, so it's not easy. So then we looked, that's how we came up to realize that what you really need is repeated vaccinations. And so we modeled that with an interval of 6 years. It could be 5 years, it could be 5 years, 2 months, and 3 days. So the initial vaccination with PPSV23 and always the repeat vaccinations with the same vaccine, that changes the numbers, really. So you prevent quite a large number of hospitalizations and deaths, and you have reasonable NNVs. Whereas to add PCV13 again to the first vaccination doesn't change anything, and it's very high numbers of vaccinations, and the costs per QALY go beyond several €100,000. So you can download that report, unfortunately only in German language from the RKI website, a full report of more than 100 pages. Are we alone with this judgment that PPSV23 is a suitable vaccine for adults? No, we are not alone, and also the JCVI in the UK already stated in 2015, that they feel that this should be the vaccine for those aged 65 years and over, and only for people at high risk of pneumococcal disease, they should have, in addition, PCV13. And that's actually what the STIKO recommends as well. Okay, so 4 more slides on what can we do to improve vaccination coverage. We don't have a national good awareness program, so this is just a pilot project that is done is called Impfen 60 plus. It means vaccination 60 plus. It's a transsectoral project including different disciplines here, also psychology quite importantly, and the target group is adults 60 to 70 years in one of the German federal states, the state of Thuringia. And there's actors involved. It's the University of Erfurt, which is the capital city of the Thuringia. That's a private firm specializing in health communication. It's us, and it's the University Hospital Jena, which is also in the state of Thuringia. It's funded by the Infect Control 2020 program and the German Ministry for, what is it in English? Research and science, basically. So the objectives of this program are to increase vaccination uptake for influenza and pneumococcus, improve knowledge around sepsis and vaccination among people in the population, reduce the incidence of influenza disease, pneumonia, and sepsis, and to ease the burden on the health care system. So it started in October last year, so they take a whole year for developing the material. Sorry, this is in German. So there will be a first intervention wave in the influenza, starting with the influenza season this year. Then there will be an evaluation and adaptation, and it will be repeated in 2018 and finally evaluated in 2019. So they started by analyzing the media use of the target age group, and they did a survey to ask people on reasons for non-vaccinations or determinants of vaccination, and identified that it's important to consider specific cognitive requirements of the target group. They do repeated pre-testing of the campaign material involving multipliers and so on, and this is the last graphic. What they use, or what they came up with, is a 5C model for vaccine hesitancy, mainly driven here by Cornelia Beetsch from Erfurt University, who is a psychologist who has specialized in the psychology of health education messages. They looked at these 5 dimensions that influence the decision whether to get vaccinated or not in 60 to 69-year-old people. So the white plane here is what people answer to did get vaccinated against flu, this is, and the red outline is people who decided not to get vaccinated. So where are the differences? So you see here complacency. So if you're more complacent, you don't worry so much about the vaccination. Confidence in the protective effect of the vaccination seems to be a major driver of your vaccination decision. Not much difference here in calculation in this age group. Calculation means you weigh the risks and the inconvenience of being vaccinated, whether not being vaccinated, which is a bit more different here in the older people. So maybe they rightly assume that their risk is higher than those here, and they, I don't know. Interestingly, one item that was very strongly rated as important is collective responsibility. So you get vaccinated to protect others, but it seems to have no impact on the fact whether you do get vaccinated or not. So maybe it's a socially accepted response, but not telling the true story. And then there is inconvenience, so that's the hassle of getting the vaccine. It was already mentioned this morning, I have to go and fill a prescription and so on. So that also seems not to be a very strong difference between people vaccinated and not. Okay, but based on these things, they want to develop the campaign. I'm over time, am I?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Summary. Well, we have seen the serotypes in PCV13 have declined in all age groups, so PCV13 alone is not the solution to the disease at hand nowadays. The serotype mix in non-bacteremic pneumonia seems to be similar to that in IPD. According to our analysis, PPSV23 is effective against both IPD and pneumonia, and I think we have found an explanation for the negative results of those two RCTs that have influenced all the previous meta-analysis and the meta-analyses have always been used as an argument to say PPSV23 is not working against pneumonia. That was the pneumolysin ELISA. Duration of protection is a problem, so we need revaccination, and we need probably more activities to improve vaccination uptake, and they have to specifically address the needs of the target group. Okay, and I leave you with that. Thank you.